there's a couple things that we applied to this project that applies to scaling the organization that even made this project possible. So let's see, last Friday, because last Friday was my last day, I'm gonna say stuff like, we do this and we do that, but that's not true anymore. They do it and I did it, but I'm still trying to break that habit. And even as I was just thinking about this and practicing, like it's gonna take me a while, since there were 10 years of that. But some of the things that we did to scale this project are the same things I did to scale the organization. So when I started so I think that'll be helpful. And even thinking about, Connie, a organization that doesn't necessarily do housing, just how we got to the place where we were able to do a large scale project. But 10 years ago when I started, the organization was going out of business and there were 2 employees. I call them the janitor and the intern, and they were part-time. One was answering the phone and one was turning on the lights and taking out the trash. And there wasn't much else going on, and there wasn't even enough money in the bank account to pay my salary. So I was like, we've got to get busy. We've just got to get busy. And so a lot of people didn't think we were going to make it. And so if you fast forward 10 years, we successfully scaled to 42 employees, a $4 million annual budget, and an $11 million balance sheet, which I guess is $12 million now if you add this $1 million project. Again, the way we scaled the organization really applies to this project. So we're a grassroots organization similar to what you're doing, Connie, providing all kinds of wraparound services, community development things, after school programming, and housing became a major crisis, and it just rippled throughout a lot of our different programs. And so, as you know, evictions were an increasing problem. They're especially bad in Indiana. And making it nearly impossible to get a lease, even if you have a job. Even if you can afford the rent, people weren't listening to people with evictions. And then if you did have a job or not an eviction, being able to afford the rent was problematic. And we also started looking at the hundreds of thousands of dollars we were spending every year on rent and utility assistance to prevent evictions. And I wasn't convinced that it was really helping anyone. And thinking about some of the rental inventory was dwindling, so the prices were just getting higher and higher and higher. And because we listened to neighbors, we also had a lot of stories of landlords, sometimes that we had connected them to, that were not maintaining their property. And so they were, paying unrealistic rent for spaces that had not been remodeled in a long time and had health and safety repairs that weren't being taken care of. And so we were on a search to find better landlords. We were on a search to find landlords that would partner with us on this new idea. So our leadership team had really been thinking about, what are we going to do about this? Because we were hearing it from all sides. And a main challenge is that our after school program is connected to the local school. So if people were having to move out of the neighborhood for housing concerns, well, then they had to leave the after school program, and their parents, we had to connect them to another community center, or maybe they went to an area where there wasn't a community center. So we really started thinking as a team, what are some things that we could do? And there are 5 things that we had used to really scale the organization, that we used to scale this project and think about this project. And so those 5 things, the first one is mission alignment, clearly. Like, we need to be thinking about our organizational culture and how we do things. What are our values, and making sure we have community buy-in. As a grassroots organization, we acquired a lot of stuff and a lot of people over the years, but we were still really connected to listening to what people were telling us, and the voices of those neighbors that were having those struggles, we really wanted to raise them up. The second one is the strong leadership team that I mentioned, both in the day-to-day operations, but also thinking strategically and having a diverse set of people, thoughts, experiences, coming together to think about those problems. If I'm the only one addressing problems or thinking about these things, then you're only going to get my limited experience. And it helps, share the burden of all the decisions that have to be made. Decision fatigue, I think, is a new word I saw, and I'm like, I've been feeling that for a really long time. And so a strong leadership team and building that over time. One, as we went from 2 employees to 10 and to 20 and 40, like clearly having leaders in the organization is important, but I also think the large scale projects take that too. The next one's way less sexy and interesting. It's those systems and infrastructure that you have to have. They are not my area of expertise. And so this is one of the things like over the 10 years that I really had to think about, but they are vital to keep everybody on the same page, accurate information. And we'll talk about why, because you won't always be around, sometimes for fun reasons, but you won't always be there when decision and information has to be utilized. And then the fourth one is strategic partnerships and relationships. That's nothing new, for some of you, but I'll show you how through this deal, it really came in clutch multiple times. And then how I was able to rely on some relationships whenever, other crises and problems and extra hoops, I've started to call them hoops, were put that we had to jump through multiple times. And then of course, data. So, we had eviction data, we had financial data, we had all kinds of data over the years and for this project that were really important. And so you'll hear about all kinds of data. Because I think if you invest in these 5 things, your organization can grow, projects can be successful, and you can apply them to just about any challenge. So for me, it was really about mission alignment. And, we had updated our mission that to really focus on, we wanted to make sure everyone in the beloved community was thriving. And that was our vision, that everybody was thriving. And so if families were living in unaffordable, unsafe housing and having to move and uproot their children, then they're not thriving. And additionally, thinking about that ripple effect and all the impact it had on our other programs. So if young people are leaving, the data we collected at the beginning of the school year is no longer valid in the middle and the end of the school year if we have a whole, half of a classroom that has changed because they've had to move, either because now they're homeless or they had to find other housing. So it was really having an impact on our youth program, which when I started was like the meat and the potatoes of our programming. We really started with after school and summer camp and teen employment programs. So when their families didn't have the financial stability they needed and had to move, it was impacting all of our other programming areas. It was really our leadership team that were bringing these stories to the table, like so-and-so has to move, so this is problem. I heard about this from their landlord, or they were, unfortunately it's the culture, I think, in the eviction space that we wait until it's almost too late to ask for help sometimes. And some funding programs are like that, right? You can't get any assistance until you have an eviction order or have a court date or have a dollar amount. And so we really put the pressure on people until that's too late. So we started talking about these challenges everywhere we went. And I mentioned before, and as you know, even if they had the money to pay, they couldn't always get the place because of that eviction. Some of the eviction ceiling projects are really helpful now. But the number one engagement strategy at the MLK Center is to come on a building tour. So if you, and I know George, you've been on a tour, but if you want to volunteer, if you want to donate, if you want to be on the board, if you want to partner with us, like whatever it is that you're interested in, if you're just driving by and decide to come inside, we're going to invite you on a tour. And we invite folks to hear about all the different things that we're doing. A tour covers our mission, it covers our purpose, our needs, our challenges, successes, and ways to get involved. And so we wove this housing crisis into every single conversation. And this unique solution that we had developed was a shared leasing program. And so we were looking for landlords to rent their properties to us, and then we would sublease them to families. And we got a mixed response. Some people still didn't want to give up control about who lived in their space. They didn't care that we were willing to sign a year lease and pay it no matter what. We were starting to ask local churches, and they were asking how they could help. We're like, well, ask your congregation members do they have property available? Would they be willing to purchase an investment property in the neighborhood and then lease it to us? And so we were just talking about it everywhere we went. We put it in grant applications. Sometimes there's questions in an application or a report, like what else should we know? What are some of your challenges? What are some emerging issues? And so we would put it in there that it was affecting the entire organization and really affecting our neighborhood. And so I think building that buzz and we started talking about how it was not a good financial investment for us to be putting money into all of these existing landlords and properties that weren't being maintained, or they were going to evict people anyway. And that really helped, I think, a couple of our funders see that this was like a problem that was impacting them as well. And was it a good investment? Housing was really impacting everyone's grants and the ability to be successful. And so finally it worked. Actually, Rachel's predecessor, we had spent probably 8 years really building a relationship. We got off on some rocky start, 10 years ago, but we really stuck with it and built a trusting, reciprocal, long-term relationship that really believed in each other's mission. And I think both thought we needed to think creatively about some things when we were experiencing a crisis. And he knew that the challenges our families were having would also have ripple effects into their work. And they were trying to look at creative ways of building housing as well. And so he had a developer on his board who had recently renovated a, I guess you could call it a flop house. I think it had 20 units, 15 or 20 rooms maybe, that were not in good condition. Lots of missing windows, boarded up windows, that they had renovated into 4 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom units. And I immediately liked it because we needed larger spaces. A number of the families in our after-school program have more than 4 kids. And so thinking about a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom unit, even though the utilities are more, it really was exciting for us that we would have access to these. And so he agreed to lease them to us. And we started with 1 unit, and then we added 2, and then someone else living there moved, and then we added 3. And so eventually we were leasing all 4 units. And it is over near 30th and Central in the Mapleton Fall Creek neighborhood. And so that is one of the neighborhoods that we serve. So we're located the MLK Center is located in Butler Tarkington, and serves my neighborhood of Crown Hill, and then Mapleton Fall Creek and Meridian Kessler. And he became a 5-star landlord for us. And even through rental challenges, and one of the teenagers caught one of the units on fire. And so we had lots of tests to this landlord-tenant relationship, and we were able to work through all of them. And like I said, eventually we were renting all 4 units. The market rate was about $2,200 a unit, and he agreed to rent them to us at $1,800 a unit. And he was so excited about that he could do that, and we still thought that was way too high. And so like the negotiation was interesting. But the families in most cases were paying us about half the amount. So he could get 22, he gave it to us for 18, and then most of them were paying $900 or $1,000 a month. In an unemployment challenge, one of the families was paying about $350 a month. And fortunately, we had some grant funds that we were able to use to make up the difference. And so that subsidized rent idea for transitional housing was another key to the project. And so we had an unrestricted programming grant. The funder didn't really care what we spent it on, whether it was, barrier busters or or grocery cards, they didn't really care. So we had dedicated that grant to subsidizing the rent at this property. And after about 18 months, things were going really well, and we had a new crisis. This 5-star landlord decided that he wanted to sell his property, and their business plan, their business model, they really wanted to go to 10-unit apartments, 10-unit structures, and this little bitty 4-unit structure just really wasn't working for him anymore. And he offered to sell it to us before putting it on the market. And we talked to our financial institution, and the numbers just really didn't make sense to us. The average that the families were paying, and even with the grant money, this mortgage payment, because I think it was an 80-20 loan, so we were going to borrow 80% and put 20% down. And so the monthly mortgage payment just didn't make sense for us. And so, the option was to hope, we really kept our fingers crossed for a while that he would sell it to someone that would continue the program. But based on those relationships and our leadership team, we just educated everybody about the new crisis that we had. And just like before, we used this opportunity to talk to donors. When they would say, hey, what's a new issue coming up? We would say, we have this really great program and now we're at risk of losing it. So we were trying to start it before, and now we just wanted to be able to maintain it. And some folks knew we had this, so we did have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people about this shared leasing idea. The city was trying to get a piece of legislation passed at the State House, and so they were citing our example locally. The local United Way spends a lot of money on housing assistance, and so they brought a tour of people interested in investing in housing. None of that really panned out, and so that would have been last summer. That we were really talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, and he didn't end up putting it on the market. And the same partnership and relationship came in key again, and so the person who connected us to that landlord was now working at United Way and managing their capital fund. So he knew about our crisis, and I think from all the tours and different agencies that they were talking to, their capital fund committee, they normally invest in building projects. So we had received a grant from them before to renovate our building, like a new HVAC system, just all bricks and mortar capital stuff. No programming money, some planning grants, maybe like a building assessment, but all capital related to your building. And so they had not paid for programming space before, like this. So a couple other organizations and us approached them about a housing grant and got invited to apply. And a couple things that's unique about this deal for us is that capital fund is only available to accredited partners. And so I don't know if they'll change that in the future, but you have to be an accredited partner or partner with one. And so that made us eligible for that. They have a accreditation process. I think it's a 2 to 3 year process. We just got reaccredited. They will only fund 50% of the project up to $1 million. So when we renovated our building in the past, it was a $2 million project, so we got $1 million from them. I think it's $1.5 million now, actually. I think they just raised that. So the purchase price of this apartment building was approximately $1 million. So we knew we could get around $500,000 or 50% of the project cost. And that relationship was really important because, the program officer will tell you what's an eligible expense, what's not, how to best sell it to his committee, learning to see, he helped me see who is on the roster, because these decisions are always made by people, right? And so I looked to see who was on the committee. One of our board members was also on there, but of course she would have to recuse herself making that decision. But I looked to see, did we have any champions in the room, right? Is anybody going to speak up for us after we do our presentation and then leave as they debate and discuss like who's going to be that champion? But also I wanted to see, was there anybody on the committee who might remember when we went out of business almost 10 years ago, right? Our reputation was pretty well known, but there were always people who would say, man, that place almost went out of business, and it's just kind of put in and they were worried about our ability to really manage the funds. And that's the same thing. I knew that from when we got the building grant a couple of years ago. And so some people are on those funding committees and those United Way committees for decades. And so of course, yes, there were a few people who remembered that. And they gave us a preliminary approval, but there were 15 contingencies. It was like a page and a half of contingencies. Like, to get this grant, you need to go do these 15 other things and then come back to us. And, someone on the committee was like, did we ask everybody to do all of these things? Is every organization getting scrutinized by this? But I took it as a way that I had a really clear checklist about what we needed to do. And the folks on that committee are real estate experts, community development, financial institutions, people that do housing and building, develop and renovations. And I think they even have an HVAC expert at one point, because I talked to them about what we needed and how big of a unit we needed and things like that. So they really, for the most part, know what they're talking about. And so I think all of the contingencies were great. One of the folks, they required us, we were going to anyway, but one of the contingencies was to get a holding company, like an entity, and one of their lawyers volunteered to help us with that. And so both the extra checks and balances also turned in. And by the way, we'll volunteer to help you do that. So that was great. Gave us again this checklist because they also require a board resolution. And of course, right, we're purchasing property. And in 10 years, I had never asked the MLK Center board to take on debt. Actually, we got rid of a little bit of debt when I started from an old loan, and we had never taken on any new debt. We didn't even have a line of credit. We had one, but we had never drawn on it. And so purchasing this extra property, I think we bought that building in 1997. So no one had really been asked to make a big decision like this before. And so I used the same approach. Let's get like a preliminary approval from the board. The first step was to ask them to give me permission to like complete the grant process, do all of these 15 contingencies and submit the grant proposal, the final proposal. And then if United Way gave us the final approval, because then after that it has to go to the United Way Executive Committee. If we got that final approval, then we would bring it back to our board of directors to actually vote to purchase the property. That way we could really do some individual one-on-one sessions with our board members as well. Some of them had never purchased property, or someone on the board had just purchased his first home, and so he didn't really have a sense of how this whole mortgage thing was going to work for us as a corporation. And then figuring out, some people just didn't think that was a good use of $1 million, even though half of it wasn't ours. Like half of it was being granted to us. He didn't want us to spend it on that property. So we spent a lot of time getting to know where people's risk aversion were, what were they concerned about, what was most important to them. And in the end, we didn't get 100%, we got almost there. But still, I think the biggest concern was not the $1 million price tag. The biggest concern was our mission and our strategic direction. And so does it make sense to go from a renter of an apartment building to an owner of a property building? Does it make sense to be the tenant and now have to be the landlord? And so, they were asking really good questions. We had just finished a strategic framework that really set some new overarching goals. We updated our mission statement. That's where our vision of everyone thriving came from, but we had not done the next level of a detailed strategic plan, and kind of passing that on to the new person was our decision. But folks wanted to know, like, where does purchasing an apartment building fall into our strategic direction? And some people didn't think it did, and others saw it as how I saw it, which is really an opportunity that we really couldn't miss out on. Did we go out and seek out properties to buy? We had looked at it a couple of years ago, but none of them made sense, so I never brought it to the board. But this time, we felt like it was an opportunity to preserve some affordable housing and preserve our transitional housing program because of their desire to sell. And so that was how we felt it was time to take action like that, even though we hadn't finished the plan. So building the long-term trusted reciprocal relationships got us that 5-star landlord and the United Way staff person, but we also needed to take that same approach with our board members and really thinking about the due diligence that they wanted us to get and providing them the data and information. Because as you know, board members are not always involved in the day-to-day operations, and they may be involved in a strategic plan, but they don't know what that looks like on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And so it was definitely a hard sell. I won't smooth over that part. It was a hard process. I think in the end, I had to sort of accept that we may not even end up buying it after all of this work and this partnership, and that it wasn't only my decision. And so thinking about that as a nonprofit organization, about who all has a role in that decision making. I think one thing that made them comfortable was the system and infrastructure that we had set up. We obviously had programming that supported the families, and that would continue, and that part was going to be the same. But we had to set up some new systems to really think about being the owner of the property, and how we were going to do a better job of making sure that the rent we collected paid a mortgage payment now, and we were being good stewards of the other grant funds that were given to us. And so the rent that we were collecting makes the mortgage payment. We ended up with a grant for half the project. We financed about a third of it, and then we put in some of our own cash for about 20% of it. And so we needed to make sure that we were collecting rent that would make this mortgage payment based on the budget that we had put together for both our board and the committee. And we needed a new way to think about, equal housing opportunities as well. What is our application process? What is our eviction process? Like, what does that management process look like? Because now just being in our program wasn't enough. And so a lawyer on the committee helped us with that as well. And our director of operations, sends the invoices, makes sure they're collected, we do housing inspections now to see if there are repairs, to keep the repair costs down, so that we can maintain things over time. And so our maintenance person and our director of operations had to take on additional responsibilities. But those are two positions that we had scaled over time. Both of them started as part-time a few years ago, and then just as we were able to grow them, we piloted the position. I like to pilot things. So we piloted the positions, and then once we were able to get people to take on more responsibility, we were able to pay more and do additional training. So I think the other part of thinking of it as a team, and this is kind of the funny part, is that our leadership team came in clutch as well. So we used the team approach to figure out the solution to the problem, both implement the problem, but then also to close this deal. And I think that's helpful as the executive director. At the end of the day, you're responsible for it, and it's on me, and the decisions, the buck stops with me. But dividing that responsibility and getting all of the input, I think, is really a stopgap to making sure that things are more successful in the end. So I had scheduled a trip to France for my PhD project. And so that was the week that they needed to have some individual conversations. And that was the week that the United Way committee had some follow-up questions, and the final details were due. And then we had to move the board meeting to when I got back to take that vote. And so fortunately, the project didn't really die on the table. They were able to continue that and building that relationship. The United Way staff person knew who to call when he needed another piece of information. Our systems and how we have all of our file sharing set up, anybody could access any information because we were waiting on the EIN for this new entity to get the loan and the insurance. We were waiting on the city to decide if they were going to help us with property tax abatement. And so there were just lots of things on that 15 item list that we had to work on, down to the end. But I think when you have really transparent communication and everyone's involved in the project, we had delegated out some of those responsibilities while I was out of the country. And ironically, when it came down to it, they decided that I shouldn't even be the one to sign some of the closing documents. We had a board member and the deputy director do that, because that was one of the 15 items as well. When there's a leadership transition at your organization, after we give you $500,000, who's going to be in charge of this project, and who's going to, who are we going to follow up with, and who's going to do the grant report, and who's going to make sure the paperwork gets turned in. Because like I mentioned, I had resigned about 6 months before that. So it made a lot of sense for me. I might have orchestrated the project or given the green light for this wild and crazy idea and partnership, but I think we have a very specific way of organizing and communicating and sharing the responsibility that works and helps with transparent information. So as I said, not everybody voted yes. But I did feel like they were all able to make really informed decisions. So it didn't hurt my feelings that they voted no, because they were clear about what they didn't like. We had 2 people vote no at the preliminary phase, and then we convinced one of them. So we only ended up with 1 board member, and he just never changed his mind throughout, and he was clear about that. And so that's helpful to know why people are saying no. And if you needed to gather more information, collect more data, or move on to the next person. Board members and their terms, they're trying to do the best that they can at the time that they're there. And the next folks who come on the board may love the project or may think that it was a risk. And so we built that in there. If it comes to a time next year, in the next few years, there are, fortunately for us, no strings attached to that grant from United Way. And so if this transitional housing project, if we decide that it's something we do want to shutter, then we can sell the property. and go from there. So in the end, like I mentioned, we established a subsidiary to own the property. I mentioned that a teenager had caught one of the units on fire the previous year, and so our insurance like skyrocketed. And so having the unit now in a subsidiary was helpful to cut some of the insurance costs and helped with the initial budget. I think I mentioned we got the grant for half, we financed a third, and then we put in 20% of our own cash. We had some unrestricted cash on hand. And then the rent collected covers the mortgage payment so that we can put those grant funds into another shared lease agreement that we have closer to the center in the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood. And so I think, you know, in 20 minutes, we've talked about this, but he first wanted to sell in the summer of 2024, and then we ended up closing on June 10th, just a few weeks ago. So that's a long process, and it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't like really scaled well over the last, I would say, 5 years, because in June of 2020, we had 8 employees. So that 8 to 42 really happened like in the last 5 years at a really quick pace, and positioning us to be able to respond to things like this. So I'll stop right there and kind of see what questions you have, either specifically about that deal or the organization. Enjoy the rest of your week.